So a senior diplomat in the British government has resigned in protest of Keir Starmer's policies that support Israeli war crimes. This is a sensational news. The diplomat in question has been identified as Mark Smith, and the content of his resignation letter has gone viral since a journalist shared it on social media. Mark Smith used to work in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office headed by David Lammy, who was recently in Israel to happily pose for cameras with members of Israel's genocidal regime. Isn't it quite extraordinary? Despite this large-scale decimation of human life, infrastructure, health, education, and now the onset of the polio epidemic, how come so-called civilized countries maintain... Anyway, coming back to Smith, his resignation letter is titled FCDO Complicity in War Crimes. So Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office Complicity in War Crimes. So he's actually terming the British government's stand on Israel as a complicity in war crimes. This is sensational. In his letter, Smith describes himself as an expert on the legality of UK arms sales as he expresses his displeasure on arms sales to Israel by the British government. And this has been a bone of contention. This has been a controversial topic for many months. Many people, many parliamentarians in the parliament have demanded a ban on arms sales to Israel. This Mark Smith describes as the British government's complicity in Israeli war crimes. He writes, and I quote, "As a former penholder on the Arms Exports Licensing Assessment in the Middle East and North Africa Department, MENAD, I am a subject matter expert in the domain of arms sales policy. Each day we witness clear and unquestionable examples of war crimes and breaches of international humanitarian law in Gaza perpetrated by the State of Israel." End of quote. Quite strong words. These are the words, these are the sentiments that experts from around the country, journalists like me, have been expressing for several months. This is by far the most damning indictment by a senior member of the British diplomatic fraternity against a government whose head has been a seasoned international lawyer on human rights himself and whose Attorney General, Richard Hermer, is one of the finest legal minds in the world. I made a video about it. You can watch it here. What was one of the most despicable moments in British politics was to see this Lammy fellow posing for cameras with his Israeli counterpart at a time Israeli settlers killed a Palestinian and set hundreds of Palestinian properties and their cars on fire in the occupied West Bank with the help of, this is important, with the help of the Israeli Defense Force, also known as Israeli terrorists. Worse, the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom shamelessly assigned the job of investigating of this unspeakable crime to Israeli criminals themselves. And he said this with a straight face.
The scenes overnight of the burning and the torching of buildings, of the Molotov cocktails thrown at cars, of the widespread rampage and chasing of people from their homes is abhorrent, and I condemn it in the strongest of terms. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that there will be a swift investigation. I hope that that investigation can ensure that those who've engaged in this settle of violence over the course of the last 24 hours are brought to justice. And I raised a few weeks ago, when I was on the West Bank, that both the violence and the expansion that we have seen over recent times is unacceptable. It breaches international norms and, of course, the domestic legal norms here in Israel.
This is a guy who had once peddled Israeli lies on raping of women and children on 7th of October.
1,300 people dead murdered, babies raped.
These lies have been busted by no less than UN representatives responsible for investigating sexual assaults on women in conflict zones.
So in short, to answer your question, no, we could not verify any sexual violence in Berry at this point, which does not mean necessarily it didn't occur. It means we couldn't verify it. And 2 of the cases that were reported were found to be unfounded.
And everywhere throughout the report, you see that I mentioned that could not be verified, and verification would entail a proper investigation. Yes, we found it to be unfounded.
And by the way, this guy never apologized for his lies, for pushing the Israeli propaganda and lies on British national TV. However, one had hoped that Lammy would behave responsibly in conformity with international laws and international humanitarian laws after he was made the Foreign Secretary. He even hinted at this in one of his earlier speeches in the Parliament.
I can confirm to the House that we are overturning the suspension of UNRWA funding. Yay! Britain will provide 21 million in new funds, some directed at supporting the management reforms recommended by the Colonna Review, and UNRWA supports more than 5.5 million Palestinians, almost 200 of their staff, have died through this conflict. Israel promised a flood of aid back in April, but imposes impossible and unacceptable restrictions. Settlement expansion and settler violence has reached record levels. The Israeli government has seized more of the West Bank in 2024 than the past 20 years.
The chap has visited Israel twice in less than 2 months of becoming the Foreign Secretary. And Israel's terrorist regime has only increased its atrocities against innocent Palestinians by slaughtering their babies and women with impunity. And yet, Lammy and his boss Starmer do not feel the need to take a bold stand against Israel. Doesn't this say something? And do you still think the UK can be called a civilized country? Thank you very much for watching this video. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, because that's one of the many ways you can support independent journalism. God bless you all.